Thank you so much for giving me some of your time today, morning, evening, afternoon, wherever we are around the world. Really excited to come in and spend about 30 minutes with you guys and give you a really neat kind of insight into what's happening behind the scenes with a lot of OSINT platforms. To give a little bit about myself, I've been working in the OSINT space for close to 15 years. Originally, I started off actually trying to build an OSINT platform to detect bullying in schools, with cyberbullying. And then that's really expanded massively into also diving into OSINT platforms that do executive protection, that do counterterrorism, and so on. Now, coming from a background of approaching OSINT from a very software standpoint and a very automation standpoint, it means that I got to spend a lot of time on really understanding and figuring out how OSINT platforms themselves are built. And back in about 2020, after working with an OSINT platform for quite a while, kind of looked upon it and said, hey, pretty much every single platform that is automating OSINT, either from the detection side or the investigation side, really has a lot of the same systems, the same kind of problems that they're approaching, etc. And so what we did, and what I do now is I co-founded, along with quite a few of the teams from an OSINT company, we co-founded DataStreamer, which is a data pipeline platform. So it is essentially what powers quite a few OSINT platforms. So the perspective I want to give you guys today and what I want to share is kind of what's happening in OSINT. What are kind of some of the things, especially in the enterprise tools and the platforms and the automation side, and give you kind of a bit of a look into how they are built. So let's start off with talking numbers. If we're trying to find threats, we're trying to find risks, we're trying to, determine if these are real, there's a lot of time and effort that I'm sure you've all experienced that goes into that. So let's say we had infinite analysts, right? And we're able to do some initial triaging. We're able to look across the internet, look across the web of data and say, what are some keyword filtering? What are some source credibility? What are some things that we can do? In that space, time is one of the biggest problems to be able to find all the right things that are on the internet. And usually, looking at a piece of content, many analysts will spend about 15 to 30 seconds to be able to do that initial triaging to understand if there's potentially a threat or there's potentially a useful piece of OSINT information within a piece of content. And then often, if let's say there is, you're then going into 2 to 5 minutes that an analyst would spend on performing kind of more of a manual validation, geolocation, maybe language, looking at the user history, doing some visual analysis and whatnot. So if we think about that and we think about the time there, and I'm not even counting the going into looking at the higher risk, deep diving, cross-referencing data, correlating, different data points from across the web together to do a whole network analysis, et cetera, which can easily take 10 to 30 minutes and up. The problem really boils down to the fact that we're looking for needles in haystacks. If you're not familiar with that term, I'm sure you can imagine it, where it's like, hey, you need to find a needle. Here's a stack of hay. Good luck. And when we're dealing with OSINT at scale, we're dealing with it at an enterprise side, there's massive piles of hay, right? And the reality is that in order to handle that, time, right? We don't have infinite analysts. And so what runs into then is, okay, well, if we want to look at certain things, so if we, for example, are trying to find the right signals in something like, let's say, a high-risk geopolitical crisis that's going on. So now we're talking about maybe war zone, maybe coup, maybe protest, maybe different things that are essentially happening there. Well, across all the content that's out there, there's probably, of all that content, of the 1,000 pieces of content that are grossly kind of connected there's really only, once you filter it down, there's really only maybe 20 signals in that 1,000 pieces of content, right? Now, you can see based off the different ones where we're talking about, high risk geopolitical and so on. Well, we're talking about higher risk geopolitical content. There's obviously higher density of relevant content. But then when you start getting into things like, for example, domestic extremism, you're now dealing with memes, you're dealing with coded language, you're dealing with sarcasm, you're dealing with really high false positive results that come up. And even when we then go down to something like general global monitoring, you're now running into, 1,000 pieces of filtered content that you might need to look at into there, because there's so much background noise that dominates, and it's almost invisible to find useful OSINT related information that you can do something with, simply just due to the fact of the sheer amount of content and how invisible sometimes things get without context. So let's kind of talk, let's use an example. So this is actually a company, I can't name any names and so on, but this is an organization that is doing large scale global monitoring. And each day they consume data from about 8 different platforms that they're looking across. And across all their different searches that they're doing and queries that they're doing, et cetera, there's about 6,000 of them that are essentially operating there. And each kind of one of these different queries that they're doing is bringing about 700 results every single day, right? So if we go and we take a look at that and we say, okay, for each query 7 come across that hits those 8 different sources, we're talking about, at 15 seconds to triage it, we're talking about 2.9 hours per query. Okay. Now, in that example, this is a mid-sized platform that has many, many different companies and enterprises using them. They're running about 6,400 queries a day. So 6,400 queries. If we take that math that we just did before, we're talking about 4.6 million results that may have an actual signal, may actually be important detections of threat, or maybe important signals for investigations and so on. But 4.6 million pieces of content. Now, let's go and stick with that. We said 15 to 30 seconds. Let's stick with the 15. If they have 15 seconds, and those analysts are working 7 days a week looking at this data, just to triage, by the way, just to triage. 7 days a week, they're working 7 hours a day. They need 110 analysts. Now, I can tell you that, I'm not going to break down the math, et cetera, but I'll tell you that you're not going to have a very easy time with a platform like that, trying to do automation at that scale from a size standpoint. So how does an organization do that? Because they can't have 110 analysts working 7 days a week, et cetera, just to keep up with things, et cetera. So when you go and you look at it, and by the way, when we talk about companies that are doing this, that are doing, this type of intelligence, there's estimated to be about 9,800 or 9,600, companies around the world. If you go into LinkedIn, for example, and you look for OSINT, you get over 1,000 companies you can scroll through before LinkedIn stops letting you click next and keep looking. So there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to do this. So how are they actually doing it, right? Well, the way that they do that, the answer is ultimately automating the workflow that data go through. So the companies then, what these OSINT platforms are doing, this is behind the scenes in many cases to what they're doing, is they are actually proceeding to automate every single part that they can to reduce noise without taking away the actual signal. So first thing is there's four main parts that they need to automate. The first part is actually bringing the data in, going and pulling the data from all the different sources and so on. The second part of that they need to then do is every single place where data is all very different, right? What do you call it when someone puts a post up on Twitter? A tweet, or X, whatever it is these days. What do you call it when someone does a post on TikTok? Is it still called a tweet? No, it's not. It's all different language. So the second part of that is that we need to kind of match all those different things together. So there's a cohesive way to look at it. Now that it's cohesive and something that a system and a platform and an application can then do, it's then, and remember, we're talking about 4.6 million here now. We need to do enrichment to it, because what an analyst then needs is they need to be able to have additional powerful filters to be able to determine what the signals actually are. And there's a lot of thoughts around, hey, can AI just solve this? Well, I mean, AI can definitely help with a lot of the different things, but there's always a risk of AI being used and trying to figure everything out, because humans are intuitively a lot better at understanding how humans operate. But what AI and NLP and all these technologies can be used for is to be able to do things like detect if there's slang or detect if there's sentiment, or maybe remove some personal information that needs to be removed for compliance, or maybe to be able to detect, hey, is there a person mentioned? Is there a place mentioned? Or are you talking about apple as a fruit or apple as a computer, right? To be able to do that level, then the analysts have the ability, when this data then runs through these different workflows, to be able to get into the platform where they can then run it. Powering the dashboards, the reports, powering email alerts, etc. Right? So let's look at how an OSINT platform would do. So let's say it's public safety, right? So you're pulling from multiple different data sources, right? We talked about tweets, we talked about TikTok. So let's say data source A, data source B is that. So the first thing that we would need to do, and what an example would be, is a company then going in and unifying the data. They then are saying, okay, well, I want to detect if it's English. If it's not English, my analysts only know English, so I want to translate it. But let's also look for asset names. Let's look if there's, let's also use some AI elements to detect, common misspellings that might happen, et cetera. Let's do some detection of slang, some detection of sarcasm. Let's maybe even infer geolocation. And this all needs to run essentially completely automated, so that it gets to the human at the other end, the OSINT analyst at the other end, as fast as possible. And this is running 4.6 million times per day. Now there's a problem. There's still a problem, though. As great as that sounds, technology sounds awesome, automation sounds awesome. There's still a problem. If you're familiar with the phrase silver bullet, it's basically a phrase about a single solution for any problem. I got a silver bullet. I have one answer. It solves everything. When I led product for OSINT platforms, the one thing that was always a challenge was that there's a big jump from when you do OSINT and you're a very good OSINT practitioner, and you start using a platform, an OSINT platform that's out there. You begin to worry about, I don't want to miss a single piece of data. And so one of the things that's a big difference now is with OSINT platforms, and this is a big trend, is that the workflows that these OSINT platforms use now are not about trying to filter, trying to remove data, trying to remove noise, etc. But like that example and like that picture I had previously, it's about adding to it. It's adding more context. It's adding more ability to filter, etc. And so modern OSINT platforms, they're not about removing all the noise, but they're about enriching and augmenting the data to a point that finding that one thing, that one signal that's important, can be found in seconds, as opposed to having to dive through hundreds and hundreds of potential pieces of useful information out there. And so let's talk numbers. Let's go back to it then, right? And this is where it goes back to then human in the loop, having a human involved in this process, right? Our example, we talked about after all these, 6,000, 7,000 kind of filters and stuff like that, and queries that are running and getting data and looking for specific terms and combinations and whatnot. Even after all that filtering, taking the trillions of pieces of data that is out there, we still got back to 4.6 million pieces of content. And there might be one, there might be 10,000 pieces. So when we go back to talking about global monitoring, we talked about there's one piece of signal in every 1,000 pieces of this filtered content, which means there should be 4.6 thousand or 4,600 alerts out there. And so when we talk about 4,600 alerts after going through all of these processes, that now drops it down to the amount of triage time that all the customers of the OSINT platform need to do combined. We're now talking about 19 hours a day because of all that enrichment that's happened and all that automation that's happened in place. So to do this quickly and as close to real time, one of the points I was asked to kind of touch on was some of the problems of scale that's there. And so I hope I gave you guys a bit of an idea as to the scale. So to do this quickly, it comes with a lot of scale. So what we need essentially is we need this filtered data. We need it to be ready to analyze. We need to be ready to triage with all those tags and natural language processing and all that stuff that we need. And we need it running fast. And so this is then where a lot of the modern platforms behind the scenes are using a component-based kind of architecture. So each part is its own. It allows it to grow, shrink, adapt. It allows, some companies are ingesting millions and millions of pieces of content per day. Other ones are doing billions. And because if we do it as a component, that also means that there's this level of flexibility. It means that if compared to, let's say, not having it, if a component-based approach, which is the pattern that they're all moving to, means that they can add things faster, right? Just right off the bat, a year ago, all the different LLMs, all the different NLPs, all the different, data sources, explosion of Gab, True Social, Parler changes, TikTok pops up, drops down, Threads come, all the Blue Sky, all these changes. So they need the ability to add coverage very quickly, right? The second thing that's kind of in there, and the reason for this trend change as well, is that designing kind of those workflows, because OSINT is never, and one of the big things with OSINT is never follow the checklist type thing. Makes it a big difference from a lot of cybersecurity stuff. It's all about understanding where, what might be present in a piece of data, being able to use that to then do a network connection to something else, or to trigger another tool, or to go and do something else. So this component-based approach that these OSINT companies are now using behind the scenes also allows them to really customize the workflows, right? Be able to then adapt to what it is that needs to be done, be able to build this filtering, this logic, et cetera, to determine what tools need to be used, what sources need to be used at what point. And the last kind of part out there really kind of boils down to being the flexibility of scale, where from these platforms, for being able to essentially control and be able to manage what money in these platforms is actually being spent on, what they're actually dedicating all their funds to, allows them to have a product that can do a lot more without having to massively increase the price, massively limiting what it can do, what the usage is, how fast it can work, etc. Now, going back to it, this example that we've had up. So this is why the data infrastructure behind these platforms look like this. This is why many of the ones who are more current focus on, the collection, the enriching, the standardizing, and providing such a wealth. And it's also how they're able to add AI elements and so on, and NLP, natural language processing, and so without destroying the data, with actually growing, with actually expanding it, etc. So it's a lot, 5 years ago, a lot of the big OSINT platform options that you could have out there, you'd search for it and you'd find what essentially is a gluing together of a couple different APIs, or a collection of web scrapers, or, a collection of my favorite bookmarks. And so that's why, for modern OSINT platforms, they're so different than what they used to be, but they still leverage a lot of that flexibility. They're not collections of little tools as much as they are workflows that interact with so many of these different specialized tools. And roughly each year, these are also growing by about 20%. So it's a world of different automation into there. Now, the last kind of few things before we kind of jump to question I want to put out is that the other thing in there is that those component-based kind of pipelines, those component-based workflows, that level of automation really is the secret weapon, really, that allows them to stay current. Because, Twitter, as an example, or X, it imploded to a fraction of what its former town hall nature was. Gab, Parler, TikTok, Path, Musical.ly, Nextdoor, Threads, True Social, different dark web networks and marketplaces, Discord and Telegram and Signals usage, etc. There's so many changes on just the OSINT sources alone. Not even talking about all the changes that have been in AI and stuff like that. Just go to LinkedIn. I swear your feed will probably be full with talking about all the trends of AI. So I'll skip that. So this is why there is this flexibility. And an interesting stat, and for the different OSINT platforms that are out there, whether you're an OSINT platform yourself, because I know there's a couple that are here, or whether you're someone who actually works for an enterprise, military force, etc., using an OSINT platform, the interesting thing is that about 46% of those organizations actually are considering alternatives every single year. So it's also caused there to not just be a thing of, hey, can we be flexible to adapt? But it also is the need to be flexible, to be able to offer specialized capabilities, to offer kind of that customization, but also be able to hold up to the data access and the data coverage that's required. So I hope that was interesting. I know I've used up quite a bit of my time here. So hopefully that information was quite helpful.